Episode 244 of the Bevan James Eyles Show, an interview with David Robson. Rightio team, welcome along to episode 244 of the Bevan James Eyles Show, your fortnightly podcast on the behaviours that create a lifetime love of exercise so you can get all the benefits that come alongside it. I'm going to be honest, I'm actually in Australia right now. Now, I've recorded this before I'm in Australia, so I'm not in Australia as I'm recording it, but I'm in Australia as I release the episode to the world. And so today's show's it's the bits before and ending bit are going to be really quick, and because I'm on holiday. And basically, it's my time for holiday. I went to Australia to do a couple of days' work for Les Mills to present at a big fitness event. And then my daughter, who lives in Cairns, is coming to see us. By now, I think I've already seen her. We went to see the show Hamilton, which I haven't seen yet, but I'm really looking forward to seeing. And we're just having some unwind time. It's really interesting. One thing over the last couple of years is my wife and I work extremely hard, as most people do nowadays. But the reason we're normally able to do it is because we take good holidays. We take quite a few holidays in a year. So we aim for 6 to 7 weeks off work a year, and before COVID. And we work a lot. So, our kind of theory is work hard, enjoy the downtime. So we would take 3 or 4 weeks off for Christmas and often do 3 or 4 weeks over winter, depending on the holiday. But in COVID, we didn't do it. So in COVID, I think the longest we had off was like 6 days. And often that was quite rushed as well. So we haven't had like the big breaks. And even 1 year, one of the periods like over Christmas time, I had my back go bad on me. So basically there's been like 2.5 years of no proper holidays. And it's really important to understand the cost of that on my life. Like, we're fine, we've survived. And when we think of the people out there on the scale of the effects of COVID on people's lives, we've had it extremely easy. So I'm not complaining. But when you've got this tool, that's a really important tool for you to recharge, rewind, and come back to life in a fired up way, it's something that we've really noticed. And I think both my wife and I would honestly say that the fatigue level that we're in right now is kind of been this build up of 2.5 years. And this trip we're in right now, we're doing basically 7 days really, because I've got 2 days of work in it. So it's like a 10-day trip. So it's not the longer kind of holiday. I don't know if you've been lucky enough in life when you've done that 3-week trip or even like a 6-week trip. I think the longest we've done is 5. And, you're halfway through a trip and you think, man, I've still got 3 weeks to go. And we haven't had that. This holiday's not that, but it's just getting that recharge in place. And maybe that's just a really important thing to think about right now is during this COVID time, have there been some tools that you haven't been able to apply because of the conditions? Like, we haven't been able to travel internationally, so we haven't been able to get that unwind that's really important for both Joe and I. And if so, how do you bring them back into your life? And to be honest, I would have preferred to have another 3-week holiday. Couldn't fit into our timetable at this moment. That will happen at Christmas time and then at the end or mid-year next year. And just how do you bring that back into your life? Because for me, I've just, I'm fine. Don't get me wrong. I'm far from in a bad place, but I have noticed a difference. I'm really looking forward to this holiday before, I'm about to get on the plane to do it. So just something for you to think about in your life. What's the area of your life where maybe, just maybe, you're fallen away from a habit that was really good for you before COVID that you can bring back into your life. Now, today's show, I've got a really good interview. And actually, this is an interview we recorded for my other podcast, my I Am Talk podcast. I'm actually releasing it on this podcast before we release it on I Am Talk. And the reason is because before we're going away, we just had a lot to do. And I just thought instead of me doing a Bevan show for this podcast, we'd put this interview up. And the interview is actually really good because my other podcast is a triathlon, long course triathlon podcast. So for some of you, you might find interest in it, but it's not really for this audience. It's kind of a very specific thing for a very specific audience. But this book is called The Expectation Effect, and it's how your mindset can transform your life. And John, my podcast host on my other podcast, started reading this book, and he heard an interview on Radio New Zealand, which is the big radio station in New Zealand. And John said, "This guy's amazing. I've got to buy his book." And he started buying his book, started reading it, and he said it's been really, like John was saying, it's been helping him to apply some really cool tools in some areas that he needed to sharpen up on. And so I haven't actually read the book myself, but it comes highly recommended, and it's selling extremely well on Amazon. So it's obviously a pretty great book. And the book is called The Expectation Effect. Again, it's how your mindset can transform your life, and it's by a guy called David Robson. And that's who we've got on the interview today. Now, you're going to see that this interview is an interview that both John and I present, because it is an interview that was designed to be on my other podcast. And at times we do talk kind of like about the athlete and the athlete experience, but I still think even if you're not necessarily like a triathlete or even an athlete as such, there's some really good insight in this interview. So I think you'll get a lot out of this interview. So I'm going to put that on in a second. Before we do, I just want to say a big thank you to the patrons of the show. If you want to become a patron, go to www.bevanjameseyles, go to support or podcast, support me, and donate some of your hard-earned money my way each time I release an episode of the show. Now, on that front, I want to say thank you to those people who are patrons. We've got Michael the Hammer Noak, we've got Renee the Hawk Hawes, we've got Michael Hardcore O'Kane, Samuel Melino Weaver, Mysterious Man, and Donald the Explorer James. If you want to become a patron, go through that process. Also, if you want to get my new book, I Will Make You Passionate About Exercise, go to passionaboutexercise.com. You get the book. If you buy the book through the website, you get the book. You also get 12 free workouts, which I've designed for total beginners. And you also get my goal setting course, my 7-day goal setting course. And it's a goal setting course that's designed to help you actually get a plan in place so it considers all the important areas of your life. And at the end of 7 days, you've got a plan for the next moment in your life. So you go to passionaboutexercise.com to support my book. Anyway, here is the interview with David Robson right now.
Okay, guys, today's guest is called David Robson. He's the author of The Expectation Effect, How Your Mindset Can Transform Your Life. If you want to get hold of the book, we'll have links in the show notes. And in the book, David takes us on a tour of the cutting-edge research that reveals for the many profound ways that our expectations shape our experience. He brings together loads of case studies and evidence-based science and uncovers new techniques that we can all use to improve our fitness, productivity, intelligence, health, and happiness. So the book's not necessarily targeted at athletes, but there's certainly a lot in there for athletes, and there's one chapter in particular we'll focus on. So I heard this interview with David on Radio New Zealand down here a while ago, and was fascinated by it and started reading the book, and my progress has been stalled a little bit from too much watching of the Commonwealth Games, but it's awesome. So welcome along to the show, David.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, can't wait to chat.
Right, before we start on the book, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your sort of background, because I know in the book you said you're not necessarily an athlete. I think your comments were you were formerly a reluctant exerciser. So tell us a bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, that's totally it. So, I mean, my kind of academic background is that, I studied maths at university, specializing in kind of medical statistics, and then I became a science journalist for New Scientist magazine and then the BBC, and then I've written a couple of books, and The Expectation Effect is my last book. But in terms of my kind of athletics career, which I haven't had at all, and actually I found PE lessons at school just really demoralizing, and I kind of brought those attitudes into later life. So yeah, I was very much a reluctant exerciser. Like, I knew I had to, for the health benefits. So I did go to the gym kind of quite regularly, but I didn't make like great progress. And I think even more importantly, I just found the whole process of exercising really unrewarding and actually, quite painful, like just, quite grueling really. And actually learning about the expectation effect has completely transformed that. So now going to the gym is actually one of my favorite activities.
So when you go to a book like this, there's so many studies, in so many different areas. How do you kind of go through that process of figuring out what you want to add to the book and finding all that research?
I mean, I guess like throughout like my 10 years as being a science journalist, I'd actually come across a lot of research, especially on the placebo effect, before I even started to think to write a book about this. And then, I just kind of kept a folder of all of the interesting research I came across. And actually, the structure really naturally fell into place. It seemed like previously we'd only considered the placebo effect, which is one form of expectation effect. We'd only really considered that in the clinical setting. But then the more I looked into it, the more I saw that it stretched to all other areas of life, which could be separated quite neatly. So there's food and diet, exercise, stress, kind of our willpower and self-control, and then aging, and all of that just fell very neatly into place. And yeah, the more I looked, the more fascinating I found it, which is why I decided I really did want to tell this big story to people.
So I thought it might be useful before we start just to sort of try to define a few of the terms you're going to probably talk about quite a bit. And I know that your book is called The Expectation Effect, and it's 200 pages or whatever it is long. So trying to define that into a concise sort of Oxford Dictionary definition might be tricky. But can you maybe explain to us what you mean, I think, firstly by the expectation effect, and then maybe just go into, we've all heard of placebo, just sort of define what you mean by that, and also nocebo, which is a term some people might not be familiar with.
Sure, yeah. So the expectation effect I just define as this self-fulfilling prophecy, where our beliefs are shaping, important outcomes through three main mechanisms, and that can be through changes to our perception, changes to our behavior, and changes to our physiology. And so the placebo effect is one example of this, and it's really been studied very heavily, in the clinical setting with trials of drugs, for example. And placebo comes from the Latin for I shall please, and it simply means that if you have positive expectations that treatment is going to be successful, then it's more likely to be successful in many cases, especially for things like pain relief, for example. And we know that that does happen through changes in subjective perception, but also changes in our physiology. So the brain can actually produce its own endogenous painkillers. Those endorphins that we have when we experience the runner's high, well, they're also released when we have when we receive a dummy pill. We're told that it's a painkiller, and those chemicals can then, in themselves, they help to relieve our suffering. So that's one example, and really provides, I think, a foundation for our understanding of other expectation effects. It's been so well studied, it kind of proves that our expectations are powerful. Now, the nocebo effect is really the evil twin of the placebo effect. So the nocebo effect is where you have expectations of becoming sick and you become sick, and it's through very much the same kinds of mechanisms that can cause the placebo effect. It's just in the opposite direction. And one really common example of this is that if you're taking certain pills like antidepressants and your doctor warns you that you might experience headaches, then actually you're more likely to experience a headache because of that warning. And we know that that is caused by changes in the brain's physiology. So things like the vasodilation of the vessels, the blood vessels, can actually change as a result of those expectations, and that can then bring about pain. And it's not just imagined pain, it's not just subjective, like it's actually, indistinguishable from when you have a headache from other causes.
And probably the one other term that I think comes up in your book a lot is what you call the sort of the prediction machine. So maybe sort of just explain what you mean by that before we sort of start to delve into a few of the case studies that are peppered through your book.
Sure. I mean, the prediction machine is really the kind of underlying, I guess, machinery that causes these expectation effects, and it's so fundamental to the way the brain works. Now, this is a theory that's been gaining a lot of ground in neuroscience, and in particular, the study of consciousness. And the idea here is that the brain is constantly preempting what's going to happen next. It's kind of forming predictions of the world around it in the moment, and then what's going to happen next. And scientists studying consciousness are really interested in this because that shapes our perception really profoundly. So the light hitting our retinas is very messy. But these simulations that the brain's producing, when the brain is acting as this prediction machine, those simulations are actually shaping how the brain processes all of that messy data from the retina. and it can sometimes kind of delete, bits of data that it doesn't think make sense, or it can actually add to it, resolving ambiguity. Often it's correct, sometimes it's wrong, which is why we experience visual illusions occasionally. Now, importantly, the prediction machine, when it's building these simulations, then it's also helping to prepare the body for the challenges that it thinks it's going to face. So it will do things like shaping the hormonal balance within the body. If you're going to need a big release of energy, then it will release adrenaline. It will change things like blood pressure, can change the action of the gut. How long food sits in your gut can be shaped by these simulations. So it's shaping your physical reality in some way. What the brain expects to happen will then shape your physical reality.
Awesome. Now, the book's broken into 10 chapters, all of which, of what I've read so far, is really transferable to athletes. But you do have one particular chapter, number 5, which is called Faster, Stronger, Fitter: How to Take the Pain out of Exercise. Now, you kicked off that chapter with quite an interesting anecdote from the Tour de France. So maybe retell that story as an example of the power of the placebo.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Richard Virenque from the French Festina team, he was he was really good at the mountain trials, but I think he struggled with the time trials. And he had heard from, other athletes that there was this amazing kind of substance going around that should actually help to kind of increase his speed and stamina. And so he asked his soigneur if he could have some of this substance. And this guy Willy Voet, he wasn't really that keen on giving like a completely new substance to an athlete in the middle of the event. It's not that they were necessarily averse to using banned substances. It was just that, and in fact, they got into a lot of trouble for that afterwards. But he didn't want the risk of kind of bad side effects to happen, that would threaten the team's chances of success. So he rather than giving this it was a kind of milky liquid that you're meant to inject into the buttocks, he just replaced it with salt water or glucose water, something completely innocuous. But Virenque really had the time trial of his life. He was just amazed by it, and he was saying oh, this substance is amazing, we have to use it every time. And it was really clear to Voet that this was just his expectations and his beliefs, that actually they had kind of supercharged his performance, and you didn't need any magic substance at all to be able to do that. And I think this is quite well known in athletics and all kinds of sports, that actually self-belief does make a difference. I think what's really important now is that sports scientists and physiologists are beginning to understand how that happens, what's occurring in the brain, how the prediction machine is boosting performance, and then what kinds of exercises we can do to kind of use these effects ourselves without believing that we're taking a banned substance.
In this chapter, you mentioned Tim Noakes a little bit. What did you learn from him in regards to how we actually use the energy systems we use with exercise?
Yeah, I mean, Tim Noakes has this great theory, which I think makes a lot of sense when you consider other expectation effects, and he very much sees it as being a part of, or kind of aligned to the other expectation effects like the placebo effect. And he sees that the brain acts as this kind of central governor, he calls it. Essentially, it's just, it's almost acting like an accountant. It's just working out kind of how much energy and resources we have in the moment, how much, we need to kind of parcel out to be able to meet our goal without risking total exhaustion or injury. And so if it believes it's kind of exceeding its resources, then it will kind of pull back. It puts the brakes on your performance. And that's not caused by necessarily any kind of big physiological change, within your body. It's not caused by, say, like the dangerous buildup of lactic acid. It's actually the brain coming to this judgment, and then it's just sending out signals to kind of pull back, to stop your exertion, to recruit fewer muscle fibers in your legs, for example. And there's a lot of evidence now that this is true. I mean, one of Noakes' own studies, he showed that even when we're exerting at like maximum capacity, we're only using 50 to 60% of the muscle fibers within the body, within our limbs. And, you know, if you were really like risking exhaustion, like it should be much higher than that, you'd think. If you were really like reaching fatigue, purely physical fatigue, you'd think you'd already be using as many of your fibers as you could. But he believes that actually the brain is super conservative in its estimates. So it's limiting it to 60% just so that you will have enough energy left within you if you do need to use your limbs for some other challenge after the race. So I find that very convincing. And then it fits with loads of evidence showing that things like placebos can be really useful in sports performance. As we've seen with Veront, but also with carefully controlled trials, we see that actually, you know, when people believe they're taking kind of a shot of really caffeinated coffee, that actually they can, you know, their capacity to lift weights is like so much higher, even when they're only taking a decaf shot instead. So, you know, and actually, you know, these scientists have shown that it's almost, the effects of caffeine are almost completely caused by the expectation of a performance improvement rather than any physiological change. So yeah, really powerful stuff.
You talk about the prediction machine and how that can influence performance. One example I remembered was, so I think they did a study where some athletes were doing some exercise and they were telling them it was going to be, you know, really hot and whatever temperature it was, but the temperature was actually quite different, and they obviously did, you know, control mechanisms with that as well. So yeah, it seems like that prediction machine can really be quite influential. So what were some of the studies you sort of found from a sporting context where what you think's actually happening can be, you can sort of manipulate people's brains when they think it's maybe XYZ temperature and it's actually quite different, and they perform quite differently?
Yeah, I mean, that was a great example. You know, just telling people that it was hotter than it really was actually caused them to, I think it was cyclists in that case, and they, you know, just kind of completely missed their peak performance. You know, another study that I really like was where they were giving people false feedback about the speed at which they were cycling. And the scientists found that, you know, telling the cyclists they were going slower than their optimum, than the actual speed they were going, then just led them to kind of go even faster. Whereas if you told them they were going slightly faster than they actually were, then, you know, they couldn't beat that because they had set a kind of mental limit on what would be possible for their own performance. So I find that really convincing too. But I think, you know, there's also some other studies looking more generally at like our beliefs about our own capacities, and I think they're really relevant for any athlete. So, you know, there was one study was looking at people's kind of aerobic capacity. So they took two tests, you know, this standard kind of test of aerobic capacity where they were, you know, measuring people's peak performance on a treadmill with escalating speeds on two separate occasions. And after the first test, the researchers just kind of casually mentioned to some of the athletes, half of the athletes, oh, you perform really well on that, like much better than average. And the others, they didn't plant a negative expectation. They just didn't tell them that they were like, you know, exceptionally good. What was really interesting then was on this second test, those who'd been given this positive expectation about their own performance, they subsequently then performed much better than the others. It was, you know, their overall endurance improved, their overall aerobic capacity was much better. And then follow-up experiments showed that it actually shaped things like the efficiency of their movements. So if they believed that they were like naturally good at you know, doing these endurance tests, then actually they seem to be moving in a way that would allow them to kind of run faster, but with while burning less energy, which is of course what, yeah, exactly, is you know, increased efficiency is what you want to have when you're doing some kind of challenging event like an Ironman event.
Dealing with negativity, you know, especially a lot of people will go into a workout kind of working against themselves being successful in that workout. And you found some really good research on that. And it sounds like you've actually implemented that yourself with fitness.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I mean, it's definitely relevant for anyone, even kind of elite athletes, I think, that you want to quiet that kind of negative chatter in your head. And I think, it's really easy for you to start to fall into this kind of catastrophic thinking about your own fitness. If you're constantly comparing your performance to someone else who might be performing better than you, that can then cause you to be more negative about your own kind of body's capacities. And then that can create this kind of vicious cycle where it through a kind of a negative expectation effect, it's reducing your performance. But I found that actually this is just really useful for reluctant exercisers like me, who might be carrying a lot of kind of baggage from their childhood that's given them negative expectations of exercise and what they can achieve. And that by removing that kind of baggage, you can start to see a lot more progress and actually enjoy the exercise a lot more. And that's what I've applied myself. And there's good backing for this kind of idea. So there was a study from Stanford University where the researchers had given people a genetic test, a real genetic test that looked at the CREB1 gene, which we know does influence endurance exercise. But they gave the participants sham feedback. So some were told they had the kind of beneficial variant, others were told they had the less beneficial variant, the one that would make them feel more uncomfortable and would reduce their endurance during the exercise. And like those other experiments that I described, they found that those expectations had a real impact. And actually, according to some measures of their performance, it was actually more important than the gene itself. So things like the gas exchange within the lungs actually depended more on the expectation than on the actual gene. So, there's a good basis that our expectations are having these effects. And so, when I was applying this to my own life, I just started questioning, this idea that I'm like inherently bad at exercise. And, the truth is that my genes will have an effect. And, I probably couldn't ever have been an Olympic athlete, but that doesn't mean that I couldn't make like good progress. Like the science is really clear that the more you exercise, the better you'll get at it. Like you will build strength. It's like it has to be the way the body functions, or we wouldn't have been very successful during our evolution if we didn't get fitter when we needed to exercise, when we needed to go on those hunts. So I just started thinking about that a bit more and focusing on my own trajectory rather than making those comparisons with other people and always kind of putting myself down. And then I also tried to rethink the sensations that I was experiencing during the exercise itself, because I think especially if you're not used to exercise, it's quite easy for you to read any kind of sign of discomfort as a sign that your body's not functioning, that you're no good, that you're just either that you're lazy or just that you're so unfit that you'll never get better. So all of those aches and pains, breathlessness, I really started to try to avoid those negative thinking spirals around all of those sensations, and instead look at them for what they really are, which is just a sign that I was actually exercising, pushing my body, close to its limit, and that was beneficial for me, that was what I needed to do to actually make progress, and to see it as a sign that I was building strength. And I found that really helpful for me in helping me to actually just enjoy the exercise. And we see from other studies that, when you have this change of mindset, it reduces the perceived exertion while you're exercising. And it actually does make it more likely that you're going to release those endorphins so that afterwards you're going to feel really good after the exercise, rather than, kind of just feeling exhausted and kind of wiped out for the rest of the day.
Awesome. Well, I think you sort of closed out that chapter talking a bit around sort of visualization, and there was some research around some brain scans of athletes that had been done to show that the brain sort of calculates exactly which muscles need to be stimulated when you're doing visualization. But you sort of talked about internal imagery is a better way of doing that rather than external. So can you sort of explain what you mean there, and any sort of tips that you picked up that athletes or anybody might find useful with regards to visualization?
Sure. I mean, again, I think some athletes have used this really well throughout, sporting history, and Michael Phelps is a prime example. Like, he didn't really believe that he had a physiological advantage, but he did believe that it was his amazing power of visualization that helped him. And he would before any event, he would visualize in like excruciating detail all of the twists and turns that he was going to make, like, right down to like the tiniest movement, essentially. He was visualizing himself doing the event, and he believed that was, what allowed him to beat all of the other competitors. And the research shows that there really is something in this, that when you visualize yourself doing exercise, that's actually helping the prediction machine to kind of recalibrate its kind of perceptions of what it can achieve, and also to plan the optimum movements to achieve the goal that you want to meet. So, that can be for, like fine kind of motor skills, like, playing golf. But actually it can also be really fundamentally important, just for building strength. The idea here is that when you're simulating those movements, you're mentally simulating them, you're kind of encouraging the prediction machine to recognize that it can afford to employ more muscle fibers within your limbs without kind of damaging itself. And so, when it's planning those movements, it just sends the right signals to make sure you're making the most of your muscles, rather than being overly conservative, which is really, its kind of default is to be overly conservative, and it's just pushing that kind of limit just a bit further so that you can improve your performance. And one study, there have been so many studies, and for one study, it was quite small, but it's really telling. They asked these participants to kind of not actually go to the gym, but just to visualize themselves doing some heavy lifting, like lifting a table, for a month or two. And then by the end, they found that these participants had actually improved their performance by about 10%, whereas the participants who had not been doing any of the mental exercise, they were actually a tiny bit weaker than they had been. Now, the nuance in this study was that they did compare internal imagery to external imagery. So, whether you kind of imagined it in the first person, you actually doing the exercise yourself, or whether you kind of were almost like in your mind's eye, you were like the fly on the wall, watching yourself from the outside doing the exercise. That didn't seem to be very effective. It seemed to be much better to actually, be really immersing yourself in your visualization. So, really imagining that you're actually straining your muscles, like really thinking about what that would feel like within your own body. That's what seemed to be best at kind of changing the prediction machine's evaluations of its own capacity, and then helping it to plan those muscle movements.
Awesome. Now, one area of the book you probably could have written about 50 books on is sort of around nutrition, and I'm sure you get lots of feedback on this and lots of requests about it. But there's some staggering studies that you sort of cite, and it's really, I guess it's more about, not so much about what we eat, but a lot of it is to do with our expectations, and controlling those can massively influence how our body responds. It's easy to point to people and just, say they eat too much, but there's a lot more going on inside the brain. So can you give us a couple of fantastic examples around labeling and maybe misleading information? The example I'm thinking of there was one around a milkshake. So maybe just sort of talk us through that, and how just simply labeling something and explaining it differently can have a massive impact on a biological level, as well as obviously in your head.
Sure. I mean, so I guess the kind of scientific theory behind all of this is that we do have within our gut kind of sensors, that can measure like the stretch of the gut, as it fills with food, and you also have nutrient sensors that can, feed the brain this kind of very rough idea of kind of how much food you've consumed. But they are really poor, and ambiguous kind of signals that you're getting. I mentioned about how the brain can shape the, what we see by kind of tailoring the sensory data hitting our eyes. Well, actually, the data from the gut is even more ambiguous than the light patterns on our retina. And so that means that it does need to use things like our memories of what we've eaten, and our expectations of what that food is going to do for us, to kind of shape its sense of satiety, and whether it should still feel hunger later on or not. So that's like the basis for this idea. And there's been plenty of research showing that, even things like food labeling can shape our expectations of satiety, and then that in turn actually shapes how full we feel. you know, if you give someone a chocolate bar or a cookie and you tell them that it's kind of, you know, high calorie, really satisfying, they're going to feel much more satisfied afterwards compared to when they, if you tell them it's kind of this health bar with like low calories and, you know, something that's kind of bland but good for you. So we know that that can have a psychological effect. It actually shapes the perception of hunger. But what this research with the milkshake showed was that actually this could also shape the hormonal response to the food. And the researchers were really looking at the hunger hormone ghrelin. So ghrelin stimulates appetite. When levels of ghrelin are high, you know, you have those hunger pangs and you kind of want to reach for the cookie jar. You know, when it's low, you know, you feel satisfied, you can focus on other things. Now, what normally happens when we eat a satisfying meal is that ghrelin might kind of peak just beforehand because, you know, your hunger's been stimulated by seeing the food in front of you, but then it drops because, you know, your brain and your body then know you don't need to eat for the next few hours. What these researchers did was they gave the participants 2 milkshakes on different occasions. They were exactly the same milkshake, but the labeling was just different. One emphasized, you know, kind of how many calories it had in it, you know, it exaggerated the number of calories to like 600 calories, like, you know, enough almost for a small meal. It said how much ice cream had gone into it, how much cream had gone into it, you know, emphasized the delicious chocolate flavor. It was kind of luxurious, you know, all of these words on the packaging made the people feel that it was going to be like a really satisfying treat. On the other occasion, they gave them this, the labeling for the milkshake was all about the kind of health benefits. It was called like a sensi shake, and it just emphasized that, you know, it basically had like 200 calories and, you know, it was quite bland, but would be, you know, it would help you to lose weight, essentially. That was what they were focusing on, what it didn't have, rather than what it did have. And the researchers showed that that shaped the ghrelin response quite remarkably. So for the people who had the kind of, when the people had the luxurious shake, you know, full of calories, full of cream, full of fat, they actually saw that rise in ghrelin and then the dramatic drop straight after they'd eaten it. For the people with the eating this sensi shake, the ghrelin levels just barely changed at all. It was as if they hadn't eaten. And that's really profound, I think, for all of the times that we, you know, if we're trying to lose weight and you kind of go into the supermarket and you're focusing only on the low number of calories in the food, and you might choose like a diet food that you're not really going to enjoy, but just because it's kind of slimming, you know, you're creating that sense of deprivation. And that could then change things like the ghrelin levels within your body that will mean that actually you're going to feel these hunger pangs you know, much more strongly later on in the day, which just means you're going to be so much more tempted to kind of snack after having had your meal than if you had something with the same number of calories, but that, you know, had really emphasized the kind of enjoyment and pleasure that you were having from that food. So that's something we really need to bear in mind. I think if we are trying to lose weight, or even if you're just trying to maintain a stable weight, is that, you know, we should see our meals as a kind of celebration, and that actually, you know, when we're dieting, pleasure is a really important ingredient in the foods that we're consuming.
What I like with the chapters, all the chapters you do, is you sort of do a nice little summary at the end of each chapter, which kind of gives some action points. So, you know, guys, what you're going to find in this book is lots and lots of case studies, you know, science-based case studies, evidence-based, and then there's nice summaries at the end. And especially in that sort of nutrition chapter, there's definitely some takeaways you can have. I'm trying to lose a few kilos myself at the moment, and there's a few little bits and pieces that I've picked up there, and it's made a nice little difference. Just thinking, as David said, thinking about what you're eating, think about what you've eaten, avoiding distractions like watching TV when you're eating. So he's got lots of good practical advice. So David, I could probably talk to you for a couple of hours, but guys, what you want to be doing is actually going out and reading this book. I think you'll all find it fascinating. It's called The Expectation Effect. We'll have links to it on our website, and I know you've also got a couple of other titles that you've done as well, David. So yeah, awesome. We'll have to get you doing a triathlon at some stage. Your expectations will be honed in. You'll be on fire. But no, thanks so much for your time, and any sort of final comments for the athletes out there.
I just think that the big lesson that I learned here was that when I'm exercising is to see it as a kind of not just training my body, but training my mind. And if I have a bad, day where my performance is really below par, like not to catastrophize that or to feel too anxious about that, but actually to just kind of be compassionate with myself and to tell myself that actually, maybe that is just what my body needed at that stage. And that actually, you need to listen to your body, but then, I can still go into the next session feeling that I can still have those optimum expectations, and basically to focus on my trajectory. So, my path, from week to week, month to month, rather than getting too focused on every single session. And I think that's just like quite good advice in general for athletics, but also for, all things in life actually, is that we can't always be performing at our best.
Well, and that's the thing, isn't it? All these lessons are transferable to many different areas, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think the same skills that you might learn, changing your mindset around your kind of sports performance could equally be really useful. Like if you're, trying to kind of improve your performance in your job, or if you're kind of a student at university, changing your academic performance, it's really transferable.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, David.
No, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Righto, team, hopefully you enjoyed that interview. So again, the author is David Robson. The book is The Expectation Effect, How Your Mindset Can Transform Your Life. And I'll put a link to his book and his website in the show notes for today's show notes. I'm going to pretty much wrap things up there today because I'm actually jumping on the plane tomorrow morning. I've got a few more jobs I need to get done before I go away. It's one of the downfalls of owning a business is that to have a holiday, you've got to get all your work done before you go. And then when you get back, you've got to go to get catch-up mode. Or to be honest, I don't know if that's just a small business owner. I think a lot of people, that's kind of life nowadays, especially if you want to do that thing of actually shutting off. Like when I go on holiday, I don't want to be checking my phone all the time. I don't want to be, doing work. And so, if you want to have a holiday, you've almost got to do that process. So I've got a few more things I need to get done today, but that's okay. Now, if you want to support the show, go to bevanjameseyles.com, click on podcast, support me, go through the Patreon process, and you can deliver some of your hard-earned money my way. If you want to get my new book, I Will Make You Passionate About Exercise, go to passionaboutexercise.com. Also, please spread the word. And if you can, because this book is doing so well, I'm just haven't had enough Amazon reviews yet. So if you could take a couple minutes just to jump on Amazon and give a review about the book, or audible.com, that'd be really, really great. Even if it's just giving a star rating, I'd really appreciate it because it just helps me get the word out there. Other than that, I'll be back in a couple of weeks from now with the next episode, and it'll be a Bevan show. I'll go deep into something at that stage. Anyway, as always, keep being you, and I'll see you next time.